I'm Tom Steward. I'm going to be basically just talking through a brief overview of my PhD as it stands at the moment, which is asking the question, how does demand-side governance of the UK energy system affect affordability of energy for domestic consumers? So, a very brief overview. I must first say that these bits aren't entirely distinct. They will overlap a bit, so there will be possibly a bit of repetition. So I apologise for that, but it all meshes together, so it's fairly unavoidable, I'm afraid. But basically, I'm going to be doing a kind of an overview of the central question and breaking it down a bit, looking at my research questions, why I'm doing the research I'm doing, how I'm doing it, and finally the boundaries to my research, so what I'm not going to be doing. So this is my central research question. How does demand-side governance of the UK energy system affect affordability for domestic consumers? So I'm just going to kind of go through the bits I've got in bold there to kind of break it down a bit. So in energy policy, you can kind of split it up into supply-side and demand-side policy. I'm looking at the demand side. So that's investigating how we use energy, where we use it, kind of what we get from it, and especially now kind of how we reduce the amount of energy we're actually using. And I'll kind of go on to explain why that's a beneficial thing in a moment. So governance formerly used to be just kind of considered as the acts of government and kind of governing bodies, things like local authorities and obviously the EU, that sort of thing as well. But that's actually been expanded, so still encapsulating that. It's kind of now moving into a network of actors and agencies. So moving, I suppose, down the tree into the wider market, it's now including things like energy companies, energy generators, users, the regulator, the system operator, these sort of bodies, but also moving up above these sort of bodies as well. So looking at the overall paradigm in which our energy system is kind of placed. So the idea that we should be using markets rather than government intervention, or the ideas around that we should entrust our energy supplies to kind of private companies rather than, again, the government being more involved. So that's kind of how I'm framing governance in this sense. So affordability is kind of a particularly slippery concept to try and get hold of, really. There are a few ways of kind of framing it and looking at it. One is to look at fuel poverty. So at the moment in the UK, if you're in fuel poverty, it's because, or if you're considered to be in fuel poverty, it's because you're spending more than 10% of your annual income on your energy supplies. And so therefore it's very easy to say anyone in that situation has an unaffordable energy supply and anyone outside it doesn't. But actually that for me feels like a very blunt instrument. And of course, at the moment, what we're seeing is more and more people getting concerned about the costs of their energy supply. More and more people are being affected by it. So as bills are going up, the wider society is being impacted. And that's kind of what I mean by that second bullet point there, that actually it's not just something that affects those on the lowest incomes, it's something that impacts the whole of society. Finally, it can be looked at in terms of what it means for businesses. So obviously, as energy prices go up, businesses have to be able to still supply their products or their services, and so the charge for that has to go up as well. Also, it may mean that some businesses choose to actually move to other countries with cheaper energy supplies, so take their investment and their jobs with them. But what I'm focusing on is not actually the business aspect, as say, it's domestic consumers, so households. What does affordability mean for them, really? The whole kind of backdrop to this is around decarbonisation. So, as kind of we've heard a couple of times already this afternoon, the need to decarbonise is well established now. And the way this fits with a smaller level of demand is fairly kind of well meshed together. The idea being that if we have lower levels of demand, then actually there's less supply that we need to decarbonise. There's less energy we need to produce. So these are my research questions. I'll kind of go through those one by one. The first one is trying to consider exactly what we mean by affordability. How do we rate something as affordable, and how do we measure or quantify that? As I said, it's kind of a slightly slippery issue, but what I'm expecting to do is not actually come up with a new measure for fuel poverty. It's what I'm trying to generate is kind of a dashboard of measures, as it were. So there are different aspects that go into affordability besides just your annual cost. Things like how your costs distributed over the year or actually over a longer time period. It may be, that actually your energy costs are on an annual basis quite low. But if your bill all arrives in one chunk or in a few kind of large chunks, how affordable is it? Similarly, over kind of a longer period of time, if this year your energy bill is quite low, next year it spikes, and then kind of following year it drops down again. Again, how do you manage that spike in those prices over the year? So there are some other aspects besides just the average cost which need to be considered. So what can be identified as the core determinants of affordability of energy bills in the UK? So energy bills obviously are kind of how people access and how people pay for their energy, but they're made up of a few different aspects. An obvious division basically is some charges are levied on a per usage basis. Things like the paying for your gas is obviously the more gas you use, the more you pay for it. But there are other parts of your energy bill, things like the subsidies that go towards renewables, are actually paid for on a per metre basis. So each person will be paying the same amount irrespective of how much energy they're using. This means that obviously people using less energy, a larger portion of their bill are made up of these charges. So actually, is that considered affordable or not? So it's these sort of questions, trying to get under the skin of not only kind of what goes into our bill, but why does it go in like that? Why is it rated like that? And so trying to unpick these sort of relationships and these questions. Point 3, I think, is kind of fairly self-explanatory. Within the current governance system in the UK, what the roles do varying stakeholders play in adding or reducing cost to bills, thereby promoting or detracting from affordability? So I've mentioned the number of different kind of bodies involved in governance. Some of those are going to be involved in, I suppose, adding cost to bills. Other ones are actually going to be promoting demand reduction and therefore reducing costs on bills. There are kind of various different groups and different interactions I'm going to be looking at. One particularly will be energy companies at the moment obviously make more money out of selling people more energy, whereas that's not necessarily the only model that can be gone with. There's energy service companies, ESCOs, actually make their money by selling light and warmth rather than selling electricity and gas. But those exist almost exclusively in kind of the business sector at the moment. So there may be other models that can be followed that may be worth kind of investigating. Part of my research suggests that it's worth looking actually, although I'm looking at the UK, it's worth looking at other countries and looking at other sectors basically. So seeing kind of what else can be done elsewhere and what the best practice is there. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be looking at Denmark and doing a comparative study there. So seeing what their practices are, what the rules of governance are, and how they've come to that state of being, to see whether there are any viably transferable lessons to be learned for the UK. Finally, what I really want to get out of this project is some really viable policy recommendations. I don't want to, or I may well, I don't know, end up at the point where, okay, actually it turns out that it's the overarching policy paradigm which is the biggest barrier to affordability in the UK. But paradigms are notoriously difficult to change and slow to react, so I still want to be able to produce something really solid and really viable in terms of a policy recommendation, which isn't just something like, we need to change the paradigm. I want to produce something that can actually be done in the time frame that decarbonisation really needs. So why am I doing what I'm doing? Energy bills obviously are becoming increasingly a very political and important issue. There have been considerable energy bill increases over the last few years. Between 2003 and 2010, prices went up, or bills went up 78%. And that actually continued, and in the last 5 years alone has gone up 43%. With it, energy poverty, as you would expect, has risen. The most recent figures we have, which is 2003 to 2010, shows increases from 6% of the population to 16%. That's 4.75 million homes in fuel poverty at the moment. So it's clearly really important to a lot of people, and it's increasingly affecting larger swathes of society. Energy security concerns are, again, they're very widely talked about, and depending how you frame that, if you talk about kind of the lights going out, the lack of supply, then it's clear why reducing our demand is actually going to be beneficial. But beyond that, if you frame energy security as actually getting the right amount of energy in the right place for the right price, it is clear why that actually heavily interacts with affordability issues. I think it's really important to kind of just note briefly, and this is something that's not widely talked about, kind of especially in the media and kind of popular debate, is that our level of demand, the amount of energy we use, is entirely the product of decisions that are made. Policy decisions that are made today will shape how much energy we're using tomorrow. It's often talked about this energy gap is discussed about as if the amount of energy we use is fixed. That's far from the case. As we move to decarbonise our system, it's going to be expensive. It's going to cost us. There's no way, there's no point in pretending otherwise. And so how we manage these costs across society is particularly important. So we need to make sure that they're not just being kind of loaded on to say those that are least able to pay for them, but actually that is managed. And hopefully we can then make the transition kind of as smooth and as kind of undisruptive for consumers as possible. And that's kind of part of the reason I'm looking at demand reduction, actually, that we've got a hugely inefficient housing system in the UK. We've got a lot of wastage in our system. And, that's potentially, I suppose, you could view that as a hugely untapped resource. So the idea being that basically as you reduce demand, that can effectively reduce the impact of increasing energy prices on people's bills. So for example, for easy maths, if energy prices were to double in the next 20 years, but actually you could reduce everyone's demand by 50%. That's obviously hugely kind of insulating them from the effects of those price rises. So essentially what I'm setting out to do will examine policy to reduce total household demand in order to support affordability, with particular reference to how governance of the energy system in the UK is affecting our ability to do that. So a very quick look at kind of how I'm going to do what I'm going to do. As I say, there'll be a large amount of policy analysis in there with a comparative study between the UK and Denmark. So what it's going to require is me to get a really solid knowledge base, how the rules and incentives around the demand side, kind of how they operate and how they've come to be in the UK and in Denmark. What I'm then going to do is kind of hopefully plug any gaps and add to that with semi-structured interviews from a number of people. This is, I say, by no means an exhaustive list, but this is a list of a number of the people that I'm expecting to be able to talk to. The regulator is obviously an important one. Large and small energy suppliers and generators, the Department of Energy and Climate Change, the system operator, network operators, NGOs, local authorities, ESCOs, as I said, the energy service companies that are operating, manufacturers, and the Danish Energy Agency. I will say, as I'm working, I'm connected to the iGov project in that I'm able to sit in on their meetings and hopefully contribute to a couple of working papers in there. But my project is distinct from it, so it will hopefully feed in, but it's operating, I suppose, almost as a satellite on its own. Finally, what am I not doing? So what I'm focusing on, as I said, is household energy demand. This means I'm not looking at businesses and what businesses are doing. I'm not going to be looking at the effects of behaviour, or I will be looking at the effects maybe, but not the drivers behind behaviour and service demand. So what this means is obviously there are big decisions that people make. Some are larger, things like do we get our loft insulated? And some are smaller, things like do you switch off lights when you leave the room? These are really, really important questions, really important matters for the level of demand we have. But unfortunately, it's just beyond what I can look at. I'm also not going to be looking at any detail in exogenous factors, things like as climate change occurs, obviously our energy usage is going to change, so this needs considering, but again, I'm not going to try and kind of look at the drivers involved there particularly. And finally, I'm not going to be aiming to get involved with any specifics around technology beyond the impact that they may have on people's costs. So I'm not going to be making recommendations around we should be using, wind power instead of solar power, or people should be using kind of biomass boilers instead of ground source heat pumps, these sort of things, unless there's obvious kind of overlaps with what that means for people's costs and people's affordability. So yeah, I think that's it. Thank you very much for listening. If anyone has any questions, I can have us. Yeah.
What about, how are you going to look at the notion of affordability in relation to other kinds of household costs? Because if the cost of living is rising, food costs, petrol,
Yeah.
All of that sort of thing, that impacts affordability.
So how am I going to?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I should have. This was in my notes, but I clearly didn't mention it. In the kind of the dashboard approach that I want to try and do when defining affordability, one of those things is going to be around the kind of the cost of living and the average kind of income. So those sort of things do need to be incorporated as well. Absolutely. Yes, that's where I see it going in. Yes.
I'm quite interested in how it ties into things like the Green Deal,
Mm-hmm.
about do all this to your house and pay for it for 25 years.
Yeah.
There's that idea of how is that tied in current things which actually promise future savings. So rather than change the tariff now and save money in the next direct debit, it's install this and save money.
over the next kind of over a very long term. Yeah, no, I think that's particularly, I'm going to use the word politely, interesting development from the government in terms of what they're offering, and that will absolutely go into kind of the policy analysis. How those things kind of affect people's affect affordability, and also who can access these schemes, because those sort of things they still have they carry quite a high rate of percentage on the interest on the loan is actually still quite high. So questions around affordability, I think it's really pertinent there, because okay, so you may have no upfront cost, but firstly they're still wanting to do a what's the word, kind of do an assessment of your ability to repay, and also actually you're paying 7%. It's about 7% more than someone that could actually just pay for it up front. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting one, trying to unpick what that means for affordability in terms of upfront against paying for it over the whole time. Yeah, no, I think that's really relevant.
Anyone else?
It was just a random question about how affordable energy should be. I mean, could you do a comparison of the UK to the rest of the EU, for example, and see how affordable energy is, in terms of household income?
Oh, I see. Kind of as a percentage,
well,
or
just so
as
we know where we are in terms of how big the problem is. These fuel poverty is a classic one, and getting band-aid round. But it'd be nice to have some kind of grounded evidence in terms of where we are and how. What's the context?
Yeah. I think certainly as far as Denmark goes, I want to be able to do that. As far as the wider kind of the rest of Europe goes, because what I'm expecting to kind of come out with as my measure of affordability is going to be quite detailed and quite nuanced. Hopefully, it would be absolutely possible, but I imagine it's going to, because it would be so different for every different country. It may be quite kind of labour intensive to try and produce that dashboard for each country. They're absolutely possible, but whether that's possibly stretching a bit far in 3 years, I don't know.
Why should energy be affordable?
It's a very fair question, because I think if we kind of view it that everyone has a right to access energy, everyone has a right to a warm home, and having lights on when it gets dark and that sort of thing, then it's something we need to ensure that everyone can have access to.
Energy for light and keeping warm, use it for all sorts of things.
That's very true.
Electronic, only useless things like televisions.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I can see they would be better to keep people warm, safe. But isn't that a danger that you make affordable energy, you waste energy, because you use it for so many things that are not essential?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's a very fair comment, and I think hopefully, I suppose you can leave it up to people to a certain extent to make the decision whether they turn on their heating or turn on their television if they've got to make that choice. But I suppose that's part of why kind of reducing demand and trying to weave efficiency into the system actually is so beneficial, that actually if people are choosing to have another light on or have a television on, that actually it's not using huge amounts of energy, hopefully. I don't know if... Oh, absolutely. I'm not trying to advocate that we should use no energy, but if we can gain the same amount of service out of something that uses considerably less energy, that's obviously beneficial. But no, I think that's a really interesting question.